There was something breathing in my basement. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, because I have had 40 years to rehearse how to say it, and I still cannot make it land soft. So I will say it plain, the way I have always said hard things. There was something breathing in my basement, and it was not an animal I had any name for, and it was not small, and it was not scared of me. Not even a little. I am Stephen Hale. I am 68 years old, and I live alone on 14 acres outside of a town so small it does not show up on most maps. I am telling you this now because I do not have the luxury of waiting anymore. My doctor used the word progressive last month, and I watched his mouth move through the rest of the appointment without hearing a single word he said. Progressive. Like it was a good thing. Like something moving forward was something to celebrate. But I know what forward means at my age. It means the finish line is closer than I thought, and there are things I need to say before I cross it. I am not asking you to believe me. I stopped needing people to believe me a long time ago. What I need is to say it out loud to someone before it dies with me. You are that someone. I am sorry it has to be a stranger on the internet. I am sorry I do not know how any of this works, the algorithm or the thumbnails or whatever the YouTube police require from an old man with shaking hands and a story that will make you question everything you think you know about what lives in the dark places of this country. My granddaughter set this up for me. She does not know what I'm about to say. I made sure of that. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the furnace. Old houses make old sounds, and I had spent 3 years convincing myself that this particular house, sitting on the edge of 40,000 acres of northern Wisconsin wilderness, was just settling. Pipes, pressure, the groan of wood contracting in the cold. I had explanations for everything. I had spent most of my life building explanations for things I did not want to face, and I was very good at it. But the furnace does not breathe. I heard it in November. Late November. The kind of cold that does not apologize. I had come down to check the water heater because the upstairs bathroom had gone lukewarm, and I was halfway down the stairs when I stopped. The basement was dark. I had not turned the light on yet, and the only illumination was the thin gray line coming in under the small window near the foundation, the one I had never bothered to cover because nothing large enough to matter could fit through it. That is what I had told myself. Nothing large enough to matter. The breathing was low and rhythmic, not fast, not panicked. The breathing of something deeply, entirely asleep. I stood on those stairs for what I believe was 4 full minutes. I know because I counted. I count when I am afraid. It is a military habit I picked up in places I will not name tonight, and never quite managed to put down. I counted to 240, and the breathing did not change. It did not speed up, it did not stop. Whatever was in my basement was not aware of me. I did not turn the light on. I went back upstairs, sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I did not drink, and stared at the basement door until the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the hard white of a Wisconsin winter morning. Then I got my rifle. I need you to understand something about what I found when I finally went back down. I need you to understand it not as a horror story, because it was not then. It was something stranger than horror. Horror is something that wants to hurt you. What was sleeping in the corner of my basement, between the old chest freezer and the concrete wall, curled around itself with its knees pulled up and its massive arms folded over its chest like a child protecting itself from a dream, was not trying to hurt anything. It was just trying to stay warm. It was covered in dark brown hair, the kind that clumps and mats in the cold. 7 feet tall at least, and I say that from estimation, not measurement, because I was not about to get close enough to measure. The feet were wrong. Too long in the middle, too wide at the heel. The hands, and I am calling them hands because that is what they were resting open on the floor in front of it. Open, not clenched. The fingers were relaxed. The face was turned slightly away from me, tucked into the crook of one arm, and I am grateful for that even now. I am not sure what I would have done if it had been looking at me. I am not sure I would be here to tell you this story. There were two of them. I had not seen the second one at first because it was smaller, pressed into the gap behind the chest freezer, and it was the small one that saw me. It lifted its head when I reached the bottom of the stairs. Not fast, not a threat response. The slow, groggy lift of something waking from deep sleep. And it looked at me with eyes that were dark brown, almost black, and round in a way that was not quite right for any animal I had ever tracked or hunted or come across in 30 years of living rough in the backcountry of the northern states. It looked at me, and it did not run. I think about that a lot. I think about it more than almost anything else in this story. It looked at me, and it did not run. I should have called someone. I know that. I want to be honest with you from the start, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer. And I want to be clear that in the first 20 minutes of standing at the bottom of those basement stairs with a rifle in my hands, I thought about it. I thought about calling the game warden. I thought about calling my brother-in-law, who had been a wildlife biologist before he retired and moved to Arizona. I thought about calling the county sheriff, a man named Bertram Holt, who I had gone to high school with, and who would not have believed a word I said, and I knew it. I did not call anyone. What I did was set the rifle down on the third step from the bottom, lean it against the wall, and lower myself onto the cold concrete floor about 15 feet from the smaller one. I sat cross-legged the way I used to sit in the field when I needed to watch and wait and not be a threat. And I watched. The large one was still asleep. I could hear it. The breathing had that wet, heavy quality of an animal deep in true rest, the kind that does not surface easily. But the small one was watching me with those round, dark eyes, and I was watching it, and for a long time neither of us moved. It was thin. Even under the hair I could see that. The ribs were visible along the side where the arm was not covering them, and the way it was pressed into that corner, the way it had folded itself small, told me something I had spent enough time around frightened living things to recognize. It was not aggressive. It was protecting itself. There is a difference between an animal that is dangerous and an animal that is afraid. I have made my living knowing that difference. The small one, I would learn later, was a female. I did not know that yet. What I knew, sitting on that cold concrete floor in the gray morning light of late November, was that she was young. Not a cub, not an infant, but young in the way that animals are young when they are not yet fully grown, but have already lost the softness of the very early stages. She had a quality of almost adult about her that made her somehow more heartbreaking, not less. She made a sound. Not loud. A low, almost sub-vocal rumble that I felt more in my chest than I heard with my ears. I did not move. I kept my hands visible and open on my knees, and I kept my face as neutral as I could make it, and I said, out loud, in the most level voice I could manage, "I am not going to hurt you." I said it the way I used to talk to the dogs I raised before my wife left, and the dogs went with her. Low and even and without any upward inflection that might read as excitement or aggression. "I am not going to hurt you." The large one stirred. "I will not lie to you." My hand moved toward the rifle. I am not proud of that. Every trained instinct I had accumulated over 30 years of Army service and another 20 of backcountry living reached for that rifle before my conscious mind had any say in the matter. But I did not pick it up. My hand got as far as the step and stopped. Because the large one, rolling from its side and its back in that slow, disoriented way of something surfacing from a very deep sleep, made a sound in response to the female's rumble. A sound that was not a growl and was not quite speech but was unmistakably communicative. And the female went quiet. I sat very still. The large one sat up. It took a long time. It was not moving fast. It had the stiff, careful movement of something that had been cold and cramped for too long. And when it finally got upright and turned its head toward me, I had my first real look at the face. I am not going to describe it in horror movie terms because it was not a horror movie face. It was a face that was wrong in the way that a thing is wrong when it is almost right. Not monstrous, not inhuman. Almost too human in specific ways, in the eyes and the brow and the set of the mouth, and then entirely not human in other ways, in the size and the angle of the jaw and the depth of the brow ridge. It was looking at me with an expression I can only call assessment. It was deciding something about me. I decided something about it at the same time. I decided I was not going to shoot it. That decision, sitting on that cold basement floor with my rifle 3 steps away, and the November light coming gray and thin through a window the size of a shoebox, was the decision that changed everything. I have held it up to the light 1,000 times since then and looked at it from every angle I can manage. Was it stupidity? Probably some. Was it loneliness? Absolutely. I had been alone on those 14 acres for 6 years by that point. My wife had been gone for 7. My daughter had moved to Portland and called it Christmas if I was lucky. I was 62 years old, and I had not had a real conversation with another living thing in longer than I could accurately track. So, yes, loneliness was part of it. But it was not only loneliness. It was also the female, and the way she had looked at me without running. It was the open hands of the large one, asleep on my floor. It was the simple, devastating fact that they were here, in my basement, because they had needed somewhere warm, and they had found nowhere else. I understood that in a way I did not have words for at the time, and am not sure I have words for now. The need to be somewhere safe when everything outside is cold. I had felt that myself. I had felt it in places I will not name tonight, and I had not had the luxury of finding shelter. I went upstairs and I came back down with 2 pounds of raw venison from the chest freezer. I set it on the floor between me and them, and I backed away to the stairs. I sat back down on the 3rd step, and I waited. The large one watched me for a long time. Then it reached forward, slowly, and pulled the venison toward itself. It ate without taking its eyes off me. The female waited until it had taken the first piece before she moved from her corner. She ate faster, like she had not eaten in days, which I suspected was true. I sat on those stairs for 2 hours that morning, and I watched them eat and then settle back against the wall and watch me in return. And somewhere in those 2 hours, without any conscious decision I can point to, I became responsible for them. That is the only way I know to say it. I became responsible for them the way you become responsible for anything you choose not to walk away from. I did not walk away. Everything that followed came from that. I named them before I knew what they were, which I understand is backwards from how these things usually go. Most people need to categorize something before they can care about it. I have always been the other kind of person. I have always cared first and understood later, and it has cost me in every area of my life where that approach does not serve you, which is most of them. But in the basement of that house, in those first strange weeks, it served me. I named them before I understood them, and the names made them real to me in a way that pure categorization never could have. I named the large one Samson. He came to me fully formed as a name the morning of the 3rd day, when I watched him lift the chest freezer 6 inches off the floor to retrieve a piece of venison that had slid underneath it. He did it the way you or I would lift a box of books. Effortless and incidental and completely without drama. Samson. I said it out loud, and he turned his head and looked at me, and I cannot tell you that he recognized it as a name because I do not want to overstate what I know to be true. But he looked at me. That was enough. The female I named Wren. That one took longer. I watched her for nearly a week before the name came. She was quieter than Samson in a way that was not simply about size. She had a quality of observation that reminded me of the best field scouts I had served with. She missed nothing. Every time I came down the stairs, she had already clocked the direction of my hands, the pace of my step, the presence or absence of the rifle before I reached the bottom. She was reading me constantly, assembling a picture of what I was and what I intended, and the name Wren came to me on the 7th day when I realized that she reminded me of a bird more than anything else. Not in her size or her movement, but in that specific alertness, the quality of a creature that has learned to survive by reading its environment before its environment can read it. I told them their names on the 7th morning. I sat on the floor, closer than I had been before, and I said, "You are Samson." And then I looked at the female and I said, "You are Wren." Samson made no particular response. Wren blinked. By the end of December, I had established a routine that my rational mind found profoundly absurd, and my emotional mind had fully accepted as normal. I was feeding 2 large cryptids in my basement. I was buying 3 times the usual amount of meat from the butcher in town and telling him I had taken in a pair of rescue dogs, which was not entirely false in the philosophical sense. I was spending 2 to 3 hours each day in the basement, sitting with them, talking to them, learning the particular grammar of their communication. They did not speak. I want to be clear about that, because I will tell you about the one time something close to speech occurred, and I do not want you confusing that for the general experience of those years. They did not speak, but they communicated in ways I will spend the rest of this account trying to describe accurately. January of that first year was brutal. -30 for 8 days running, the kind of cold that finds every gap in your insulation and charges you for the oversight. I was worried about the basement temperature, which, despite the furnace, dropped into the low 40s during the worst of it. I brought down blankets, old moving blankets, the heavy quilted kind, that I had stored in the rafters since my wife and I moved in and never found a use for. I laid them out along the back wall. Samson regarded them for a long time. Then he picked one up, examined it from multiple angles, and laid it back down in a different configuration than I had arranged it. A better configuration, actually. More efficient for retaining warmth given the shape of the space. I stood and watched him do this, and I did not say anything for a long time. That was the first time I understood that I was not dealing with animals in the way I had always understood that word. Wren was the one who first accepted my proximity without any apparent wariness. It happened on a Tuesday in late January, around the 20th, when I came down to find her sitting near the base of the stairs rather than in her usual position against the back wall. She had moved toward me before I arrived. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and she held her position, closer to me than she had ever voluntarily been. 4 feet, maybe 4.5. I could hear her breathing. I could see the individual hairs along her forearm in the thin light. I stood very still, and she reached out one large hand and touched the knee of my jeans. 2 fingers briefly, and then she withdrew. An assessment, a deliberate contact, I said. "Hello, Wren." She made the low chest rumble that I had come to understand as neutral acknowledgement. Then she moved back toward Samson and lay down beside him in the way she always did, her back against his side, her face turned toward the stairs where I was still standing, still watching me, still reading me. I went upstairs and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My coffee went cold. The sky outside the window was the deep, flat white of an overcast Wisconsin winter, featureless in all directions, and I sat and looked at it and tried to understand what my life had become. I was not afraid. That is the thing I want you to hold on to as this story unfolds. I was not afraid of them. I had been afraid of many things in my life. I had been afraid in the army in ways that a person does not describe in comfortable company. I had been afraid when my wife told me she was leaving, and I had understood in a single cold moment that the fear was not about losing her, but about what I would be without someone to be responsible for. I had been afraid of the empty acres around this house in the first years of living on them alone. But I was not afraid of Samson and Wren. Not in those early months, not even a little. Looking back now, I understand that should itself have scared me. I know what this part of the story sounds like. I know how it reads from the outside, a 62-year-old man alone on 14 acres, developing what he calls a relationship with two creatures that science would classify as impossible. And I understand completely why a person might question my mental state. I questioned it myself regularly in the first year. I kept a log, not a sentimental one. A practical record, dates and observations and behavioral notes, the kind of documentation I had been trained to produce in the field. I wanted a record that would survive my own potential self-deception. If I was losing my mind, I wanted the log to show me. The log did not show me that. What it showed me, over the 12 months of that first full year, was a consistent and coherent pattern of behavior from two large, highly intelligent creatures who were learning to coexist with a human being on terms that felt mutual. I use the word mutual carefully. I gave them food, warmth, and security. They gave me something I do not have a clean word for: presence. Engagement, the specific comfort of being known by something that has no obligation to know you. By spring of the first year, they had begun leaving the basement. This was not my idea. I want to be clear about that too, because I've gone back and forth over the years about how much of what happened was choice, and how much was simply the situation moving along its own logic, regardless of what I wanted. The first time I came down in the morning and found the basement empty, I felt something I can only describe as controlled panic. The kind of fear that does not show on the outside, but turns everything cold from the inside. I went through the house fast, rifle in hand, and then out the back door into the 3 acres of cleared land behind the house, and then to the tree line, and I stopped there because I did not have the training for what came next, which was looking for something that did not want to be found in 40,000 acres of dense northern Wisconsin wilderness. I stood at the tree line for a long time. The morning was gray and cold, the tail end of a Wisconsin April, frost still on the ground in the shadow of the trees. I stood there feeling the particular helplessness of someone who has made themselves responsible for something they cannot fully control. Then, I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and told myself they were gone, that this was probably better, that it simplified things enormously. They came back that afternoon. They came back the way they had always been there. The basement simply occupied again when I went to check at dusk. Wren was watchful and alert in a way that meant she had been moving and was not yet fully settled. Samson had something in his hand. A piece of bark, pale birch bark, with a pattern on it that I could not identify. He held it for a moment when I came down the stairs, turned it in his hands once, and then set it on the concrete floor with deliberate care. Then he looked at me. I picked it up. I turned it over. The pattern was not natural. It was a series of marks, shallow and regular, that had been made with something hard against the softness of the bark. Not letters, not any symbol system I recognized. but marks that had been placed with intention in a pattern that repeated. I still have that piece of bark. I kept it on the kitchen windowsill for years, moving it when I needed the space and always putting it back. It is the kind of object that seems to belong in a specific spot once it has been in that spot long enough. I never understood what the marks meant, and Samson never offered an explanation I could decipher, but the act of bringing it, the deliberateness of the presentation, is still something I return to when I am trying to understand what those years were and what they meant. He brought me something. He showed it to me. He watched my response. Whatever the marks said, the behavior was communication. The summer of that first full year was the best summer I had in 20 years. I say that knowing how strange it sounds. I say it anyway because it is the truth, and this account has no room for anything else. I was 63 years old that summer, living alone, with no family nearby and no social architecture to speak of, and I was happier than I had been in 2 decades. I spent my mornings doing the maintenance work that a 14-acre property requires, and my evenings in the basement, or, increasingly as the summer wore on the back porch with Samson and Wren visible at the tree line. They did not come to the porch. They were cautious about open space in a way I understood to be survival intelligence rather than timidity. But they came close enough that I could see them clearly in the long northern summer evenings, and I would sit in the old folding chair I kept out there and watch them move along the tree line and think about nothing at all. That was the piece of bark's first year. Brought to me in April, placed on the windowsill, turned over in my hands every morning when I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee. A habit I developed without noticing I was developing it. I turned it over, looked at the marks, set it back down. Every morning. It was the first thing I did and the last thing I consciously thought about before I went to bed. I did not understand yet that this object, this piece of birch bark with its deliberate and unexplained marks, was going to be the thread I could follow all the way to the end of the story. I did not understand that yet. I just turned it over every morning and thought about the look on Samson's face when he handed it to me. The second year is the year I stopped thinking of them as creatures and started thinking of them as companions. I understand the implications of that word, and I am using it anyway. Companion is not a word I use loosely. I spent a career in environments where the word had real weight, where the person beside you was the difference between coming home and not coming home, and I do not apply it to Samson and Wren carelessly. But by the second year, that is what they were. Wren was the one who changed things first, the way the quieter one always does. She had been watching me closely since the beginning, assembling her picture of me, and somewhere in the fall of the second year she began to act on what she had learned. Small things at first. She began to anticipate when I was coming down the stairs before I reached the bottom, not from sound. I moved quietly enough that I had tested this, but from something else. Smell, maybe, vibration. Some sensory apparatus I did not have access to. She would already be turned toward the stairs, already alert and ready, when my foot hit the 4th step from the bottom. Every time, without exception. She also began bringing things to the base of the stairs. Not bark this time. Small objects from the woods around the property. A smooth gray stone, round and almost perfectly spherical. 3 turkey feathers bundled together with a strand of something fibrous I could not identify. A piece of bone, clean and dry, that I recognized as deer femur. She laid them at the base of the stairs in the morning, and I picked them up when I came down, turned them over the same way I turned over Samson's bark, and set them on the stairs beside me while I sat. She watched me handle them with an attention that felt evaluative. She was watching what I did with the things she gave me. I started bringing things back. I brought a smooth piece of lake glass, blue-green, that I had found on a trip to Lake Superior the previous summer. I brought a spent rifle casing, brass and still smelling faintly of powder. I brought a photograph of the property from the winter it had been built, 1944, that I had found in the previous owner's papers when I bought the land. I laid them at the base of the stairs the way she laid hers, and I watched what she did with them. She kept the lake glass. She studied the photograph for a long time, held it close to her face, then set it on the floor and looked at me with an expression I cannot accurately describe, except to say it felt like a question. She did not keep the rifle casing. She picked it up, turned it over once, and placed it carefully back on the stairs beside me, returning it, the way you return something that belongs to someone else. Samson was different from Wren in every particular except the ones that mattered. He was larger, quieter in a different way than she was quiet, less interested in the exchange of objects and more interested in proximity. He began, in the second year, to sit closer to me during my evening visits to the basement. Not beside me the way a dog would. Beside me, at a respectful distance, close enough that I was aware of his warmth, which was considerable, and the particular sound of his breathing, which I had by then memorized the way you memorize the sounds of a house you have lived in long enough. He sat close to me, and he did not look at me most of the time. He looked at the wall, or the floor, or the small rectangle of sky visible through the basement window. He was simply present. That was the gift he gave. Presence without demand. There was one evening in the second year, February, the snow heavy and the wind loud against the north wall of the house, when I fell asleep in the basement. I had not intended to. I had come down after dinner, sat against the wall in my usual spot, and the warmth of the space and the sound of the wind and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been working a property alone through a Wisconsin winter combined to put me under. I woke at 2 in the morning. The basement was very dark. The light I usually left on had been turned off. I sat up, disoriented, reaching for the rifle that was not where I expected it. Samson was sitting 6 inches from my left shoulder. He had not moved away when I fell asleep. He had not, as best I could reconstruct, done anything at all except remain exactly where he was for what must have been 4 or 5 hours. Wren was asleep in her corner. Samson was sitting in the dark, beside me, awake, keeping watch in the way that large creatures keep watch, without moving and without sound and with absolute attention. I sat in the dark for a moment and I said, "You stayed." He looked at me. His eyes caught the thin light from the window. I turned over the piece of bark in my hands in the dark. I had started carrying it in my jacket pocket by then, the way you carry a phone or a wallet, the way you carry something whose presence has become part of the texture of your day. I did not consciously decide to carry it. It simply migrated from the windowsill to my pocket one morning, and I never moved it back. He watched me turn it over. He had seen me do this before, in the daylight, and he had never reacted to it particularly. But in the dark of the basement at 2 in the morning, sitting beside me after 5 hours of keeping watch, he reached out with one hand and touched the bark. Not taking it, just touching it, the tips of 2 fingers against its surface, as briefly as Wren had touched my knee in the first winter. I said, "I know. Me too." Looking back, the signs were there before the end of the second year. I know that because I have looked back so many times that I have worn grooves in the memory, and in every single pass I can see exactly where the warnings were and exactly where I told myself they were something else. That is the part I am least proud of. Not what happened at the end, the choosing not to see at the beginning. Samson changed first. It was subtle in the way that changes in large things are always subtle at first. The early signs easy to dismiss because the overall picture is still the one you have come to expect. He began arriving in the evenings already agitated, not aggressive, not toward me, but carrying a tension that had not been there before, a coiled quality in the way he moved and held himself that I recognized from my time with working dogs who had been stressed beyond their capacity to manage it. They hold it in the shoulders. They move with their weight forward. They respond to neutral stimuli as though it might become a threat. Samson began doing all of these things, gradually, over months. I told myself it was the change of season. Animals are sensitive to seasonal shifts in ways that humans have lost the capacity to feel directly, and I had observed enough wildlife to know that fall brought behavioral changes across species. I told myself the agitation was seasonal, and it would pass when the cold settled and the days shortened, and his system adjusted to the rhythm of the year. I told myself a lot of things that winter. Wren noticed the change in him before I did. I know that because I can see it in the memory clearly now, the way she began to adjust her own behavior to accommodate his mood. She stopped bringing objects to the base of the stairs. She became quieter, stiller. She spent more time pressed close to Samson and less time in her observational corner near the window. She was managing him in the way that a more emotionally attuned creature manages a less stable one. She was reading him the way she read everything, and what she was reading was making her careful. The first real incident happened in March of the 3rd year. I came down the stairs at my usual time, early evening, carrying the food containers the way I always did. The basement was warm. The furnace had been running all day. Everything looked normal until I reached the bottom step and Samson came off the far wall fast, faster than I had ever seen him move, and he was across the basement before I could process the movement. He stopped 4 feet from me. He did not touch me. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood at 4 feet, breathing hard, and stared at me with an expression that was not assessment and was not neutral. It was something I had not seen in his face before, something that was not directed at me specifically, but that I happened to be standing in the path of. I did not move. I said his name once, level. Samson. He held his position for 3 long seconds. Then Wren was beside him, her hand on his arm, and whatever had peaked in him began to recede. His breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped fractionally. He took 1 step back, then another. He went back to the far wall and sat down heavily and did not look at me for the rest of that visit. I stood at the base of those stairs and I told myself it was stress. I told myself the winter had been hard and he was responding to confinement. I told myself I knew how to read animals, and this was not a threat, it was a display, and there was a meaningful difference. I convinced myself of all of these things by the time I went back upstairs. I set the food containers on the floor before I left, close to the stairs rather than my usual position, giving more space than I normally did. I told myself this was a sensible adjustment. I told myself I was being responsive to his needs. I told myself a great many things on the way up those stairs that night. What I did not tell myself was the truth, which was that something had changed in Samson in a way I did not understand, and that Wren's response to it frightened me more than his behavior had. She had been frightened before I was. She was never wrong about what needed to be frightened of. The incidents increased after that. Not weekly, not even monthly, but with a frequency and a pattern that, if I had been willing to look at them as a series rather than as individual events, would have told me exactly where this was heading. A tension in the evenings that was not always explained by any external factor I could identify. Moments where he moved in ways that were sudden and large and required Wren or my own stillness to diffuse. One morning, when I came down to find the chest freezer moved 8 feet from its original position, dragged across concrete, the marks deep and clear on the floor. He had been alone in the basement all night. No explanation for what had prompted it. No damage to the freezer itself. Just moved decisively in the night. I turned the piece of bark over in my hands that morning for a long time. I was sitting on the basement stairs while Samson lay against the far wall with his back to me, and Wren sat in her corner watching me with the expression that I had learned to call worried, because I had no better word for what I saw in her face. I turned the bark over and ran my thumb across Samson's marks, and I thought about the morning he had handed it to me, the deliberateness of it, the way it had felt like a gift. I thought about what a gift means when it comes from something you do not fully understand. I thought about whether the marks on the bark were a record of something, or a warning, or simply an expression I had been too limited to read correctly all along. I set it back in my pocket and I went upstairs. I did not call anyone. I did not change anything. I told myself I would watch more carefully. I told myself I would adjust. I told myself that whatever was shifting in Samson was something I could manage if I stayed patient and stayed close, and stayed the kind of person he had agreed to let into the basement in the first place. That was my last real mistake, and I made it with complete awareness of what I was doing. I looked at the truth and I chose the story instead. I will tell you what happened on the night of November 14th as plainly as I can. I have rehearsed this part more than any other, not to smooth it over, but to make sure I do not add to it things that were not there, or subtract from it things that were. Memory does both without your permission, especially for events that carry the weight this one does. So, I will be very plain, and I will be very specific, and I will ask you to understand that plain and specific is the only kindness I know how to offer when the subject is something this hard. It was cold. -12, the thermometer on the back porch said when I checked it at 4 in the afternoon. The kind of cold that makes noise, that makes the trees crack, and the metal of the exterior fixtures contract audibly in the night. I had been inside all day. The property work was caught up, and there was nothing pulling me outside, and I had spent the day doing the small maintenance tasks that accumulate in an old house in the same way small debts do, quietly and consistently, until you look up and they are everywhere. I went down at 6, earlier than usual. I noticed the time as I went and did not think much of it. Samson was already agitated when I reached the bottom of the stairs. Not the slow, building tension I had become accustomed to reading over the previous months. This was different. This was the quality of something that had been building all day and had reached a pressure that the space could not comfortably contain. He was moving. Not pacing exactly. Moving in tight, irregular patterns along the back wall, stopping and turning and stopping again. Wren was against the side wall, not her usual corner. She was watching him, not me. When I came down the stairs, she glanced at me once, and then her attention went back to him. I said his name. Samson. He stopped. He turned. He looked at me with those eyes that had always been so still and dark, and now had something moving behind them that I did not have a name for. And then he crossed the basement in 4 steps, and the chest freezer was in his path, and it was not when he went around it, but through it. He went through it the way water goes through something it has decided not to go around anymore. The freezer went sideways, hit the concrete wall, and the sound it made was enormous in that space, a deep metallic collision that rattled the window in its frame and sent a vibration up through the floor that I felt in my knees on the stairs. He stopped in the middle of the room. Not near me, not threatening me directly. He stopped in the middle of the room, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and his chest heaving, and the sound of his breathing was the loudest thing in the basement. Wren had moved. She had moved faster than I had ever seen her move, around the far edge of the room to a position between Samson and the stairs, between Samson and me. I want you to understand what she did. She had placed herself between us, not moving away from him, not moving toward me. She had chosen a position that required her to face him, to be the thing he would have to move through to reach the stairs. She was holding something in place with the weight of her presence alone. I have spent years trying to find language for what I watched her do in that moment, and the closest I have come is this. She was choosing. In a situation with no safe options, she was choosing which loss she could survive. I did not move. Samson stood in the middle of the basement for what I believe was 3 minutes. 3 minutes is a very long time when you are very still, and something very large is deciding what it is going to do next. I counted. I always count. I reached 180, and he was still standing, and then something changed in his posture the way pressure drops before weather. His shoulders went down by a fraction. His hands opened. He turned away. He went to the far wall, and he sat, and he put his back to both of us, and he made a sound I had never heard from him before and have not heard since, a low sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, a sound that did not have a clean emotional category in my experience, but that landed in me as grief. Pure, specific, inexplicable grief. The grief of something that has lost something it did not know it was going to lose. I sat down on the basement stairs. My legs had made that decision without consulting me. I sat down, and I put my head in my hands, and I held the piece of bark in both palms, and I did not speak, and I did not move for a long time. Wren came to the stairs. She sat at the base of them, not far from my feet, in the position she had taken on the first real day of that first full year when she had moved toward me before I arrived. She sat there, and she was very still. She looked at my hands. She looked at the bark. She looked at my face. I said, "I know, Wren, I know." She made the low chest rumble that I had always read as neutral acknowledgement, but it was not neutral that night. I had learned her well enough by then to know the difference. It was not neutral, it was something that meant I know too. That was the last night all three of us were in the basement together. After that night, Samson stopped coming back to the basement before morning. He had always come back before dawn. Always. That was the rule that had organized 3 years of my life. The rhythm I had arranged everything else around. Whatever they did in the 40,000 acres beyond my tree line, whatever they needed from that world that I could not provide, they came back before the sky lightened. Every time, without exception. After November 14th, Samson came back sometimes. It was not sudden. That is the cruelty of it. It was not a clean break that would have let me grieve it and move forward. It was gradual, the way the important losses always are. The first night he did not return, I was awake at 4 in the morning, listening for his weight on the basement floor. The specific sound I had learned the way you learn the particular creak of a step in a familiar house. I did not hear it. I lay there until the sky went from black to gray, and then I went down to the basement and Wren was there alone, pressed into the corner that had been their shared space, and she was awake. She had been awake all night. I could see it in her face. I sat down on the floor beside her. Not on the stairs. On the floor, closer than I usually sat, in the space that he usually occupied. She allowed this. She did not move toward me or away from me. She simply remained where she was, and we sat together in the early morning light and listened to the house, and I thought about all the things I should have done differently, and did not say any of them out loud because there was no point. He came back the next day, late afternoon, which was wrong in itself. He came back changed in a way that I could feel from the stairs before I had even reached the bottom. The quality of the air in the basement was different when he was in a state I had come to call outside state, carrying something from the woods that had not been present in him when he left. He was not aggressive toward me. He was never, in all of this, directly aggressive toward me. But he was large, and he was changed, and he was carrying something I could not name. And Wren watched him the way she had been watching him for months, with the careful, continuous attention of something that is prepared to move. December was the hardest month of my life, and I say that having lived through a number of months that were serious contenders for that title. He was present half the time and absent the other half, and when he was present he was only barely the Samson I had known, the creature who had handed me a piece of bark with deliberate care and sat beside me in the dark. He was something older than that now, something that the woods had been reclaiming piece by piece since the previous spring, and that I had been refusing to acknowledge was being reclaimed. Wren stayed. Through all of it, through every night he did not come back, and every afternoon he returned wrong. Wren stayed. She stayed in the basement. She came to the base of the stairs when I arrived. She accepted the food I brought without the wariness that had characterized their first weeks. She was present in a way that felt like loyalty, and also like exhaustion. The loyalty of something that has committed to a place and cannot explain, even to itself, why the commitment holds. I began sleeping in the basement. Not every night, not at first, but starting in mid-December, on the nights when Samson had not returned by midnight and I was awake listening for him anyway, I started bringing my sleeping bag down and laying it out along the west wall and spending the night there. Wren adjusted to this without apparent difficulty. She would settle in her corner, and I would lie in my bag, and the basement would be quiet except for our respective breathing and the sound of the wind against the north wall, and occasionally, far off and deep in the woods beyond the tree line, a sound that I had been hearing since the first winter and that I had never been able to classify. A sound that was not a wolf and was not anything else I knew. A sound that came and went without pattern or explanation. A sound I had planted in this account much earlier, and I did not tell you then what it meant, and I am not going to tell you now either, because the truth is that I still do not know. What I know is that on the nights I heard it, Wren heard it too, and she would lift her head and orient toward the sound with an expression that was not fear and was not recognition in any simple sense. It was more complex than both. It was the expression of something that knows a thing exists and has complicated feelings about that fact. I watched her face those nights and I thought about all the things that existed in those 40,000 acres that I would never have access to. All the context I was missing. All the story I did not have permission to read. The piece of bark was still in my pocket. I turned it over every morning when I woke on the basement floor, the habit unchanged by the change of location. I turned it over in the cold of the December basement with Wren watching me from across the room, and the winter light coming thin and white through the small window, and the marks caught the light differently down here than they had at the kitchen window upstairs. There was a depth to them I had not noticed before, a patience in the making of them that I had not fully registered. Each mark was placed with care. Each mark was intentional, not the record of an animal, the record of something that needed to leave a mark and chose to leave it here with me, I said. Samson. Out loud to no one. Wren made the chest rumble. Once, softly. January arrived with the specific cruelty of a Wisconsin winter that has decided to be remembered. The cold was structural, the kind that does not lift even at midday, the kind that makes the light look cold as well as feel it, a flat, hard white that pressed against every window of the house without warmth or variation. I was 65 years old that January, and I felt every year of it. My knees ached going down the basement stairs. My hands were stiff in the mornings. I moved slower than I had at the start of this story, and I was aware of it in a way that served as its own quiet reminder that I was not going to be able to do this indefinitely, regardless of what Samson chose to do. He had been gone for 11 days. Not gone in the way he had been absent before, the unpredictable nights away that had become the pattern of the previous 2 months. This was different. 11 days with no sign, no tracks in the snow around the perimeter of the property, and I checked every morning, taking the full circuit of the 14 acres in the cold with my rifle and my field glasses, looking for any evidence of his passage. Nothing. The snow was clean and undisturbed except for the usual deer tracks and the small punctures of birds, and once, near the north fence line, a set of prints that might have been his, but that the overnight wind had already half filled, and I could not be certain. Wren knew he was not coming back before I did. I know this because of what she did on the morning of January 13th. I came down the stairs to find her not in her corner, and not near the base of the stairs, and not in the space along the west wall where she had moved since I began sleeping there. She was at the small window near the foundation, standing in the thin winter light with her face turned toward the glass, and she was holding something against her chest with both hands. The piece of bark. She had taken it from my jacket pocket while I slept. I had not felt her approach, and I had not felt the taking of it. And I say this not as an indictment of my vigilance, but as a testimony to how quietly she could move when she chose to. She was holding it the way I had held it every morning for 3 years, cupped in both palms, and she was looking at the marks the same way I had looked at them, with an attention that was searching for something the object could not quite provide. I did not move for a long time. I stood on the bottom step and I watched her hold his bark in the cold winter light, and I felt something I do not have a name for even now. It was grief, partly. It was recognition. It was the particular sensation of understanding something about a situation that you have been almost understanding for a very long time, and having the final piece arrive not as a revelation, but as a weight settling. I said, "Wren." She turned. She looked at me. She looked at the bark in her hands. Then she held it out toward me, both palms open, the way I had held it toward her in the early days when I was first learning what kinds of exchanges she would accept. I crossed the basement for the first time since the incident in November. I walked past the space where the freezer had been, now pushed back to the wall with its dented side facing in, and I walked to where she stood at the window, and I took the bark from her open hands. The marks looked different, knowing I was seeing them for the last time. Or maybe I was seeing them differently because I finally understood what they were. Not a message, not a warning. A record. Samson had been keeping count of something the same way all creatures keep count of things that matter to them, with whatever tool is available, in whatever medium holds. He had counted something on this bark, and given the count to me, and I had turned it over every day for 3 years without understanding that I was the right custodian for it, even if I never understood what it recorded. Wren put her hand on my arm. Not briefly, the way she had touched my knee in the first winter. She kept her hand there, on my forearm, her weight a pressure that was light for her and enormous for me. She was looking out the window. I was looking at the bark. We stood that way for a long time while the cold, white January morning pressed against the glass, and the 40,000 acres of Wisconsin wilderness lay still and silent in every direction, and the empty basement was full of the particular silence of everything that used to be here and was not anymore. She left that afternoon. She did not slip away in the night the way I had expected, the way Samson had gone. She left in the afternoon, in the flat winter light, through the basement window which I had never understood could accommodate her until I watched it do so. She went through it with a care and precision that told me she had measured it long before today. She did not look back. She moved across the cleared ground behind the house at an angle I had not expected, not toward the north tree line where I usually saw them at the perimeter, but toward the east, toward the deep wilderness beyond the far fence, and I watched from the small window until she was gone. I turned the bark over in my hands, both of them gone now. The basement empty, the piece of pale birch bark in my hands with its patient, deliberate, unreadable marks. I went upstairs. I put the bark on the kitchen windowsill where it had always lived. I stood at the window and looked out at the empty cleared land behind the house, and the tree line beyond it, and the flat white sky above everything. I stood there for a long time. The coffee I had made that morning was cold. The house was very quiet. That sound came from the trees, far away, deep and directionless. The sound I had been hearing since the first winter. The sound that was not a wolf and was not anything I could name. I stood at the window and I listened to it, and I did not reach for the rifle, and I did not go outside. I just listened until it faded, which it did, as it always did, without explanation. 3 years have passed since Wren went through that window on a January afternoon and did not look back. I still live on the 14 acres. I still check the perimeter in the morning, though I have not found tracks that I could confidently attribute to either of them since the spring following her departure, when I found a single set in the soft mud near the north fence line that were the right size and the right shape, and that I chose to interpret as I needed to. Maybe that is self-deception. At 68, running out of time and entirely out of pretense, I find I do not particularly care. The basement is storage now. I moved the chest freezer back to its original position and stacked things against the walls the way I used to before any of this began. Old moving blankets in the rafters. Boxes I have been meaning to sort since my wife took her things and left me the remnants of our shared life as a kind of accidental bequest. The light is always on when I go down there now. I turned it off once, out of habit, and stood in the dark at the bottom of the stairs for about 30 seconds before I turned it back on. I am not interested in what I feel when the basement is dark. That feeling belongs to a conversation I have already finished having with myself. The piece of birch bark is still on the kitchen windowsill. I have had it examined once by a colleague of my brother-in-law, a woman who studies semiotics at a university in Milwaukee, and who I told only that I had found it in the woods and was curious about the marks. She looked at it for a long time. She asked me several questions that I answered in ways that were technically accurate and contextually useless. She said the marks had a deliberate quality and showed evidence of having been made with a hard, pointed implement over time rather than in a single session. She said the pattern was consistent, but that she could not identify it as any known system. She handed it back to me with the particular expression of someone returning, something they have decided is outside their expertise, and I thanked her and drove the 4 hours back to the property and put it back on the windowsill. Consistent but unidentifiable. Made over time, with deliberate care. I turn it over every morning. Not looking for answers anymore. I stopped expecting answers from it somewhere in the 2nd year after Wren left, when the grief had settled enough that I could look at it without needing it to give me something. Now, I turn it over the way you touch a scar. Not to understand it, because it is yours, and touching it is the way you confirm that what happened was real and happened to you specifically. I did not understand that the bark was never a keepsake. It was a count. Samson had been measuring something I could not name, marking it down in a form that meant enough to him for him to bring it into my hands. Maybe the days. Maybe the nights. Maybe the length of time we had all been together before the woods called them back. I still do not know. I only know that he made the marks with care, and he gave them to me as if I would one day need to understand what they meant. One morning in late autumn, the year after Wren left, I stood at the kitchen window with the bark in my hand and heard that sound from the trees again. Low, heavy, far off but unmistakable. I did not go outside. I stood still and listened while the cold pressed against the glass and the wind moved through the branches behind the house. The sound came once, then again, farther to the east, then silence. I looked down at the bark and realized one of the marks had deepened from the weather and the years, the crack line splitting slowly through the old grooves until the pattern was no longer whole. It struck me then that everything I had tried to hold still was always going to change. Not because I failed, not because I loved badly, but because wild things do not belong to the people who saved them, and the best we ever get is the time they choose to stay. That is the truth I carried too late and too long. Love is not what keeps the wild from leaving. Love is what teaches you how to let the wild go,